All right, it's exciting. This is the apparently first annual military and NewSpace panel. So welcome on board, guys. We're going to have some fun. I'll do some introductions. To my left is Colonel Russ Teehan. Colonel Teehan is the director of the Air Force Research Laboratory Space Vehicles Directorate at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, which focuses on space science and technology research and development, as well as advanced technologies integration and demonstration. His organization manages an annual budget of $307 million, not quite the $1 trillion market, although if you project the defense budget maybe over the same time, it might get to $1 trillion by 2040, I think was the date. He's focused on enduring Air Force space missions, including communications, position navigation and timing, missile warning, space situational awareness, and defensive counterspace. If you ever heard Colonel Teehan talk, you know he's one of the biggest thinkers in the military, so we're excited to have him on the panel. Just to his left is Colonel, well actually now Dr. Jim Planeaux. Jim is a retired Air Force colonel, currently a space enterprise consultant, and he has a 30-year Air Force career that he's leveraging, which was last highlighted by his role as the chief architect for the Advanced Systems Directorate at the Space and Missile Systems Center and Los Angeles Air Force Base. Before that, he served as a program manager and leader in both remote sensing and launch. And he earned his PhD in chemical engineering. And I mention that because he's now grown the commensurate beard with that PhD that the military didn't quite allow him to do. To his left, we have Colonel Stephen Bhutto. All right. I also have a hard to pronounce last name, so I was very clear to get that. He is the space portfolio lead for the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, or DIUx, in Silicon Valley. Colonel Bhutto has an incredibly unique background, a very amazing blend of both science and flight hours, which is probably reason number 300 I'll never be an astronaut. He's the former commander of the 129th Rescue Wing, which is credited with over 1,000 lives saved, and including more than 400 performed in combat, which is pretty remarkable. Fun fact, we were both Terps. He has a master's in science from the University of Maryland. To his left, we have Colonel retired Bob Hodgkiss. He is the president and CEO of Hodgkiss Consulting. So he supports new and established business development strategies in aerospace and industry products for commercial and government customers. In his final Air Force assignment, he served as the director and senior material leader for the Launch Systems Directorate at SMC as well. And he was the program manager of the $1 billion+ EELV program. So quite the distinguished panel with experience from all different segments of the space world across the Air Force. So we're excited to get going. Now, as a panel lead, I usually let you all do your intros. I'm going to ask one question at the end. I'll let you think about it. I need your Starbucks order as we go through, since we're doing coffee shtick, I think, for every single one of the panelists, so we can prepare that for the end. Also, as a panel lead, it's very rare to have an opportunity where the president comes out and talks about a Space Force like the week before you are going to do a panel. So I promised them all I'd be light a little bit, but we're going to get right into that. It's not only a hot topic. I know it's a hot topic because my wife, who cares less, even less about what I do for a living than anybody, asked me that question. She said, "What's this Space Force thing?" I said, "Finally, she cares." So, all right, so we'll get into it. I'm going to start with Colonel Teehan and Colonel Bhutto. Without kind of getting into the aspects of it, regardless of which way we go with this thing, Congress or the administration, what are some of those pieces of this that have merit, or sort of why is this discussion coming up? And I'll start with Colonel Teehan.
I was hoping you'd go with Bucky first. So I think many of you all, I've interacted with many of you over the past. I think I'll state my thoughts right off the bat, and then I'll get into the second half of that question. But from my perspective, I've watched through my entire career the space enterprise struggle with integration with the multi-domain. You watch the chief of staff and many of the generals try to figure out how to seamlessly stitch the space community into a networked architecture. And my read is that will get harder at first as we start to kind of figure out what does a Space Force look like, what are the primary missions. I kind of equate it, when I'm talking to my young officers, right, I equate it to when the Air Force broke off from the Army, right? Army Air Corps at the time in World War II was working close air support and strategic missions. when it broke off from the Army, it focused mainly on the strategic missions, and it took us 30, 40 years to get back to really good close air support. It wasn't really till Desert Storm, et cetera. So it took a while. I suspect that will have a similar effect on the Space Force. Right? When I'm in the discussions with our senior leadership on how to use space to affect multi-domain operations, those are good, healthy discussions. I suspect when a Space Force breaks off from an Air Force, we just want to make sure that we don't do what the Air Force did when it broke off from the Army. Don't lose multi-domain operations, but my personal suspicion is that will be hard. When you talk to true space professionals, very few of them talk about multi-domain operations. They focus on space for space's sake, and that's my number one fear. Most of the things I had been doing with John Antonin and frankly Bucky, and he'll probably talk about some of those later, were more how do you get space stitched into the multi-domain fight, and I don't really feel like I got a lot of help from a good chunk of the Air Force that works space. I got help from ACC, PACAF, the folks that really need that space support. So I think that will get harder in the near term, but I'm hoping it doesn't take 50 years, as it did with the Army Air Corps, to get back to multi-domain operations. Over to you, Bucky.
Colonel Bhutto.
Yeah, so as you heard in the introduction, I'm not from the space side of the Air Force, but my mission area in the Air Force, combat rescue, personnel recovery, we are big-time consumers of space. And so we couldn't do the missions that we do without all the things that that space provides to us. So just to amplify what Russ brought up, is that it's really about that integration, synchronization of capabilities, and there's no better way than making sure people are fused at the hip to do that. So, but I'm optimistic. When we were kids and people thought about the future, we thought about there being not just, of course, space shuttle, military astronauts, civilian astronauts. Commercial, industrial astronauts, the whole gamut, and so I think there's a natural point where to leverage the NASA presentation. We're in this transitional period, but I think that what'll be good is we have to really anything worth doing, not just from science but also in the military. If you're going to be cutting edge, you have to be willing to take risk. You have to be able to operate at the edge of the envelope of the domain in which you're doing operations. We have enjoyed air superiority in almost every fight that we've entered in the past 3 decades. I don't know of a future that we could maintain air superiority in a fight without having space superiority. So if the right thing to do is to achieve that via the Space Force, then by all means I think we should do that, but it has to be done carefully.
All right, we'll open it up a little more to our ones that have infinite hindsight after taking the uniform off. In your walking around and your experiences, sort of what thoughts do you have on this? We'll start with Jim. And one of the major pieces I'm thinking through is also what are the different organizations and piece parts of the military that could potentially have it? What are some of the efficiencies you might see out of something like this?
Yeah, so I'm kind of diplomatically on the fence on this because I see through my career there was a lot of times where it'd be difficult to do what I did. Like I started my career teaching and doing research at the Air Force Institute of Technology, which had a very strong space component, and I don't see that being replicated. There's probably other things in the infrastructure that the Air Force will provide to a Space Force in whatever way it continues into the future. So I have a hard time seeing a complete separation. On the other hand, I did see through my career many times that folks didn't really nurture the space expertise probably as much as they could have. So, leaders like Russ, you don't find too many of them because they weren't necessarily cultivated to be cutting edge space thinkers through their whole career. So I agree that we need to be careful not to overdo it and to separate that integration with the warfighting aspect across all of the domains that we've cultivated over many years. But I didn't like being told that I needed to evaluate my lieutenants based on, write their OPRs, read their performance reports so that it translates accurately into fighter pilot language or loggy language. I mean, I think we should promote talent for the kinds of challenges that we're talking about in space in this conference based on the talent to do space and the excitement to be an innovator and to move ahead there and not to water it down with some of the factors. Likewise in the programming process. You're always told make sure that your charts that go up to the Pentagon withstand the scrutiny of other domains that don't know anything about space. And part of it's reality, and that's sort of the way that the system is built, checks and balances, but at the same time, that's not going to get us to cutting edge space capability if we don't change something. So I see change coming, and I think there's going to be some pros and cons to all the models that are put forward, and hopefully folks weigh these kinds of considerations when they come up with their decisions on how to do it.
So I too have seen many models and many struggles in this community growing up through my 30 years in the Air Force and working ground, satellite, and launch sides of space. I share the concern with my operator colleague to my right and my fellows with whom I've served multiple times. As all the political forces come to bear within the DC area of operations, as well as within the Department of Defense, let's not lose focus on why we do space at all. And that's to support the people at the pointy end of the spear, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and national level decision makers. That's why we do space. It happens to be a domain that's hard and fun and interesting to explore, but we're there to serve others. If we can keep the focus on how do we better provide that service to those ultimate customers and de-emphasize some of the politics, then we've got a shot. Unfortunately, having had a couple of tours in Washington, I know that's a tall order. And given the politically charged environment in which we currently live, it's a taller order. It's also pretty clear that the Department of Defense has been pretty resistant to this, especially the Air Force. I mean, if you heard the corporate Air Force message at the National Space Symposium a couple months ago, it was, we got this, and they never said it, but the message was clear that we don't need no stinking Space Corps. Well, it's pretty clear the political leaders don't believe them. And so now institutionally, how will that entity who's been summarily rejected publicly react to still be able to keep the focus on those people who are the true consumers? That, to me, is something we've got to watch carefully.
All right, let's swing the pendulum from the extremity of politics and oversight to the other side of innovation. Colonel Butow, in your role, what have you found to be the keys to sort of successful interaction between startups, Silicon Valley, NewSpace, or what are some of those, in your opinion?
Well, first I'm going to, little audience interaction. If you've had any kind of interaction with DIUx, not just me, but anybody in our organization, can you just raise your hand? Yeah, so that's pretty good. So if you didn't raise your hand, I'll be around all afternoon. But the most important thing that we have done is we opened up our doors to allow commercial industry, folks who've never done work with the government or with the Department of Defense, to tell us what they're working on, and then provide a model so that you can bring your commercial solution to solve an interesting problem. We like to say wicked problem, but we have very interesting problems in DoD, and they're not all combat related. A lot of them, they could be medical issues or information technology issues, autonomy issues, and of course space issues. So what we try to do is we look at what you offer. We evaluate you based on technical feasibility and commercial viability. And then if we do business with you, we want to do business with you in a way that's consistent with the way that your commercial company is set up. So that's kind of a short description about DIUx. In terms of the, we work with the new space community, we work with the old space community. the most important thing is we're trying to find ways to accelerate getting innovative new ideas, new thinking, new products and services into the department and put them to use, so that so we can move forward and solve other problems. Sometimes that involves your company. It might be a teaming of your company with a traditional defense contractor or other companies or even labs. So we have the flexibility to do this because we use other transaction authority to do our contracts. And this is the same authority that NASA used to send men to the moon back in the 60s. So when John F. Kennedy said, we're going to the moon, everybody applauded. When he said we're doing it within a decade, all the acquisition people fell out of their chairs. So Congress had to grant this this other transaction authority. So we had an alternative means of being able to do business with industry to accelerate innovative ideas, prototype them, and put them into execution. So there's no new tricks in what we're doing. It's just how we do that, and then how we engage with companies like yours so that we can know what you're doing and allow you to help support your national security and defense without reinventing your company.
That's great. So Colonel Teehan, one of our previous panels mentioned the Space Enterprise Consortium and sort of the OT model for acquiring it. So those who are not familiar, the OTA structure provides sort of a streamlined acquisition and prototyping and engagement mechanism for both traditional and non-traditional defense companies. So what are your thoughts on models like this, and sort of what other models have you seen work or what the DoD is looking at that to kind of encourage that non-traditional participation?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think ultimately our goal, I recall when we were looking at Space Enterprise, we're trying to look at different ways of doing business. We're looking at different ways of looking at the architecture. You're foolish to not look around you and see there's tons of new space and international entrants into the space arena, but they're moving faster and faster and faster. So ultimately it was Colonel Antonin and I at the time that basically made the call. We jumped a flight, snuck in to see the SecAF to talk about, we've got to enhance our contracting capability to the point where we could write broad contracts with large swaths of companies that could execute specific, what we would call CLINs or line items later once upon engaging with industry and at the speed of that industry. I equated it at the time when we were meeting with her. We were talking about semiconductor industry, right? In the late 70s, early 80s, the U.S. government would have said, I need the trusted foundry, I need to just do these things on my own. But slowly, by the late 80s, early 90s, it was pretty clear these companies were starting to outspend the U.S. government, probably 10 to 1. I'm sure it's probably 1,000 to 1 at this point. But at some point, when someone's outspending you at that rate and is making decisions at a rate that fast, you've got to have contracts pre-negotiated in place so that you can agree to do something and execute that contract in less than 90 days is my read right now. And if you can't execute in less than 90 days, that company is gone. They're already, whether it be you're negotiating, I want to get on the next launch. Okay, well, make your decision, send me the money, secure the contract, or I'm moving on, because there's 300 other people in line right behind you, and they will get that contract secured and moving. So in the current environment where the U.S. government is one of many participants in the environment, the goal was to get to these larger, faster contracts. And I think I like the OT. We've been working broad area announcements, BAAs. We've been working some of these accelerators, and that's what actually Colonel Bhutto and I have been talking about, what's next? How do we get into different business models where the U.S. government is not handing down specific actions the way the U.S. government would have done something, which is really the equivalent of pulling the commercial market to the way the U.S. government would do it, which is a really inefficient way. And the commercial market may do that in the near term, but in the long term, they won't do that, nor should they do that. In the end, it's how do I shift my requirement and my need in closer alignment with the industrial base and where the industrial base is already going. So some of these are, and Bucky and I had been talking about it, even the way we're acquiring launch is not a healthy way to be, we're just not acquiring it the way other people would have acquired launch. So, so there's multiple contract vehicles coming down. I would say the speed of contracting needs to get down to the sub 3-month level. If we can keep these things at the sub 3-month level with pre-negotiated contracts and also alternative business models that allow us to go in manners consistent with how commercial would acquire, then I think we can keep moving.
So Bob and Jim, in your sort of perspective, what have you seen that seems to be different, working, exciting, related to all this?
Okay. Let's see. The one that immediately comes to mind, since Colonel Teehan was talking about the spec OTA and the new contracting vehicles, I got to participate with some of the folks that are here on at least one of the contracting activities that's gone through that vehicle. And the thing that was very eye-opening to me was that it was kind of a different business environment with the government and with other partners. It's not just 150-odd companies, all of whom can bid on things and get there quickly. Partnerships are encouraged, and they're facilitated, and they're not nearly as constrained as they would be in a very formal contracting activity where the government can't talk to you after they drop their RFP onto the street. So in our example, we had very frank and open conversations with the government about what they were really looking for, and they also basically were allowed to do matchmaking where they were looking for a team that had some mission area expertise, that needed some legacy depth from some of the current primes, some new way of thinking, some of the framework kind of stuff that Eric Fisher talked about this morning. You know, what's the right business model for doing basically it was a ground system recapitalization and modernization, but also innovators from academia and from NewSpace. And they really wanted to build a team that brought the right mix of capabilities from the entire sector. So I think that's very encouraging that the government is able to work more freely in this new environment. It's another reason you should, if you don't know about this consortium and the way of doing business, to look into it further. And I think there's even extensions of that model where even if it's not a government OTA, there's probably some models there where some partnering between companies that have gotten the message that their current way of doing business is not the right model, it doesn't fit. They're trying to spend their IR&D money to better posture for the future, but they may not have the capability to do what they need to do quickly. Maybe they partner with a NewSpace company that can basically be their IRAD arm, and between the two of them, they come to the government with a much better proposal for what the government's looking for to go fast and innovate.
So the new capabilities, like we're just discussed here, are awesome new developments if you're a government person. If you're from industry, you're going about darn time. The biggest challenge for making all of this happen, though, is remember that it is a multi-year cycle just to get the money into the hands of the program office to even be able to go out and say, let's engage industry to try and solve whatever this wicked problem is, or push technology in a given area. So the reformation is happening sort of on the acquisition side, and we're getting some momentum. We're not yet there on the government budgeting side. So if there's a place where you would like to seed the ground and go engage and try and help yourselves down the road, go talk to the members on the Hill about what can be done to make the budget process more responsive so that it is a government business is attractive to you. Because not only is it a multi-year cycle just to get the money in the budget, it is then appropriated with many different specific appropriations and authorities and rules that are set in statute that the government program managers still have to operate within. Money is not green in the United States Department of Defense. It is many, many, many shades. And so understanding how you can align your financial resource problem with how do I work with commercial industry, that's where the Venn diagram doesn't overlap very much right now. And so I'm confident my government colleagues are going to keep pushing on that. We're going to need your help on working the Hill to get them to really walk their talk of reform and create the opportunities that the greater space community is seeking.
Okay. All right, we're at halftime of a panel in a warm room, so I'm going to lighten it up. Jim, Pearl Jam or Soundgarden?
Pearl Jam.
Okay. The correct answer was Temple the Dog, which has both Chris Cornell and Eddie Vedder in it. So we're in Seattle. I got more of that shtick coming too. So. All right, so I want to focus a little bit more on, I'm going to go through sort of 3 different segments, right? So let's talk about the space segment for a second. There's obviously significant investments that are being made in space capabilities by commercial companies with SpaceX, communication, satellite constellation, OneWeb, Planet Lab, obviously the imagery. So what are some of the ways that the military can, or may leverage these or other types of investments? And I'm just going to kind of go down the road this way. Let's start with Colonel Teehan.
Okay, I think my read, we've been attacking that problem. Actually, I was out in the lobby for an hour with so I'm heading the Space and Missile Systems Center. Can't really say what my job's going to be. I think I know what my job's going to be. But in that role, I'll be trying to analyze alternative architectures, the commercial architectures, and levying requirements on the commercial architectures. We're looking at them from multiple different perspectives. I'm noticing all national agencies are looking at the commercial architectures. To first order, they were looking at the commercial architectures from a kind of a hierarchical perspective, assuming the U.S. government is at the top of the hierarchy and thinking out of the goodness of their heart, I might levy a requirement on a commercial company. I think they're starting to realize those commercial companies are turning over increments that are way larger than the governmental architectures, and they're learning and moving really fast. So that shifted us to an architecture, a set of homework assignments for, if those folks are going to build several hundred element architectures, do I want to leverage their bus manufacturing capability and put special military payloads into that? Or I think I've been part of pretty innovative debates between some of our best government seniors, between the national communities. And I think the folks that look at it from well, if they're going to build that many architectures and they're clearly across multiple mission areas, why would we not just levy the requirement on the architecture itself and don't get down into levying specific requirements on, would you build me this bus, would you build me this payload? I think you can see that in a lot of the intelligence community, right? We used to get to can I task this bird at this time to go do this? Now the intelligence community seems to be more of, look, I don't care when you do it, I don't care how you do it, get me this information and get it to me by this time. I could see the Air Force architecture and multiple other architectures starting to head the same way. So we started with can I buy a bus from you? We then went to can I put payloads on you? And I think now we're heading to, can we just levy data service requirements on you, and can you deliver that? And I'll tell you, other than contracting, our number one challenge right now in the Air Force is how to command and control a layered architecture. How do you command and control, even if I can work the contracting that we talked about and I know how to buy that service, now I'm having to shift the way I do operations so that if it's space situation awareness, one of the programs Bucky and I are working on is a program called CAMO, and we're working a space situation awareness capability with a specific commercial company. General Raymond loves it. He's pushing, but he loves it because it's a very fast company, that he likes the fact that the commercial companies are moving. But now he's seeing, and Bucky asked me, I think my homework assignment out of this morning's meeting was, how are we going to command and control that so that we're not wasting the time of that commercial company? When that commercial company comes in at a very fast rate and produces a service and a capability that the U.S. government is shocked and says, man, I cannot believe that you provided that capability that fast. How do you command and control that so that we can then execute more contracts like that in the future? So the commanding and controlling seems to be the challenge that I'm going after right now, is how do we get into prototype demonstrations that the U.S. government not only knows how to acquire it and put the contract in place in a fast manner, but how to lean on that capability in a command and control environment so that it knows how to acquire things and command and control it. If it doesn't know how to do that, it won't do it.
So I could probably come up with a whole number of ideas here, but just a few come to mind. My perspective mainly comes from, I was on a job largely like what Colonel Teehan's going into here, when 3 years ago General Hyten said, go off and come up with a space enterprise vision, and oh, by the way, find ways to leverage NewSpace in commercial. And everybody was very excited about that. But pretty much at the end of the initial round of studies, it was very hard to find a mission alignment where it was super obvious that one of the priority missions for where the Air Force really needed to recapitalize, which tended to be nuclear missile warning, command and control, and some space situation awareness and the command and control capabilities. There was really an obvious fit of a commercial capability that was ready to go. The comms were good, the imaging was very mature. So the mission alignment was something that was not as mature as would have been desired. So I think just communication back and forth more freely between the folks that are still looking for what's the best niche for the commercial role in some of these missions that don't have an obvious immediate commercial payback is a challenge I think needs to be addressed. You know, a few that come to mind that I've discussed with Colonel Antonin are IR, the low altitude IR. So that traditionally geostationary and highly elliptical mission on the Air Force side. Moving target indicator, SAR, there's a little bit of talk about that earlier today, but doing that to replace the JSTARS airborne mission, and the Air Force has kind of made a corporate decision that they don't know how they're going to do it, but they're going to move away from an airborne capability to a combination of other things, including space. And wide area surveillance is another, which is just where, in a big theater like the Pacific, where is everything? You know, those are some examples of mission alignment where I think a little more dialogue between the user and acquirer side and the commercial industry would help stimulate some more ideas for where commercial could help. And then another one I think, and it's probably also been mentioned already, is that things that are going into space that are kind of thought through so that they kind of become self-policing. They are going to help the government keep track of where they are, what they're doing, you know, are they friend or foe, those kind of things. You know, we can probably make some smart decisions up front about things to design in now so that we don't wind up with everybody willy-nilly doing what seems to make sense and then have a big control problem and space traffic management and so forth down the road. Just a few ideas of some of the space challenges ahead.
DIUx was stood up by the Secretary of Defense as one of a few entities under the Defense Innovation Initiative, the goal of which is to either foster or enable future offsets, technology offsets that would give us a decisive advantage. Past offsets include GPS, night vision, our ability to do precision, targeting using lasers and other capabilities. So where do you find these offsets today? And back in the 70s and when those previous offsets were really coming, most of the research and development was done by government and like big corporations like IBM and Xerox and things like that. So, but today, a significant amount of research and development happens in companies like yours and other institutions. So that's why we cast the net out wide. It's interesting that the very first contract that we let under our space portfolio wasn't for a satellite, it wasn't for a rocket, it wasn't for a ground terminal. It was for artificial intelligence and machine learning. So what we and this is probably one of the most the highest potential offset of this generation is our ability to process large amounts of data and derive new insights from it. So this is why this is important. So one of the first lessons that we've learned in exploring that area is that you don't just need a lot of data, but you need the right kinds of data and what the right types of temporal resolution or revisit rates. So if you want to go look at a glacier in Alaska, you can image it every once a week or once every 2 weeks, and you'll be able to model its behavior quite well. But if you want to count cars in parking lots or shipping containers in a port, you need to be able to look at these things more frequently. So anything that's of interest to us has a different time constant with it. And so the best way to really understand what's going on with the world is to image it several times a day. Well, that sounds like a Planet commercial, right? So small satellites in dense constellations with frequent revisits, and then multiple phenomenologies. Think of what that can do for you. But then you can't just do it with the satellites. In order to have a lot of satellites, you have to have lots of access to space. So we said, well, we can't just fund satellites. So we started working with Russ and SMC and others. We started funding small launch to create, accelerate the pace of launch providers, commercial ones, small launch, not like the big guys, and to make it easier for not just us but for you to get your sensors into space. We started working on software. That's how we got involved with space situational awareness, but we're also working on other software applications. And all these things have to be done in an agile way that integrate together to achieve new effects. And then the thing we're probably going to be working on going into next year is how do we reduce data latency. You know, the problem with using a ground station is we have to wait and wait and wait and wait. And the satellite gets over it and you get the data, and then you wait some more, and then somebody actually gets the information that they needed 20 minutes ago. So all these things, commercial solutions that in this room that can deal with all those. So for us, we want to be able to open the door, work with the commercial sector, explore these things, and rapidly put them to test, prove out these concepts, and then figure out how to transition them and make them a more sustainable part of our national security and defense.
And so as you try to do all of these challenging things, there's one long-lived and still living challenge that you also have to overcome, and that's working with the government's security requirements. And so how do we take some things that are very important to the government that we don't like to discuss publicly and be able to engage very entrepreneurial companies who may have workers from around the world, may have investors from around the world, who may or may not be viewed as trustworthy in the eyes of the United States government. And so from a classified requirements or touching a classified network perspective, there's fertile ground there yet to be accomplished. And it's something collaboratively where new ideas may be in this room. That's a great opportunity for a win-win. And it's not just in the classified world. Everybody out there is aware of the ever-growing cyber threat. And so as these new capabilities are developed, there's a business reason that you want to protect it. There's a national security reason that we may want to protect it. How collaboratively can the government and industry work together to keep those ideas, those capabilities safe? That is a very, very challenging problem. And it's just yet another layer of complexity, another nonlinear variable in the multivariable calculus that's going to go into this relationship that the Department of Defense is trying to build with the NewSpace community.
All right, Bob, what's your Starbucks order?
Tall skinny latte.
All right, easy enough. We have one waiting for him afterwards, I think. So, Colonel Teehan, if you're evaluating different investments that we make, or what's the next dollar you could invest, if you're looking at the VC community, what would that type of thing be, or what would that decision criteria be?
So I agree with where Bucky was going, and in fact, we talk about this a lot. I think the two areas that I'm focusing on right now with NewSpace are space situation awareness and weather, which I kind of bin those two are in very similar areas, and then the data analytics. Right, those are the two areas that I feel like there's already significant overlap with where the commercial markets are going. And you know, a lot of the things that I work on in my current hat with Air Force Research Lab, I'm watching the expenditure rates on data analytics outside the fence line far exceed that inside the fence line. So frankly, I've told all my folks to get the hell off the base and go work outside of the line. Stop creating data repositories within fence lines. There's way more data out in the open right now than any data that I can have inside a fence line. It's more fun, more innovative, more peer review. You can move a lot faster with the large sets of data that are outside. Space situation awareness and weather also seem to be in that same boat. There's, the governments at the time were building 3.5 meter telescopes, big radars, et cetera. But photon by photon, you can go that route, or you can go with just tons of small telescopes, tons of smaller radars, spread your apertures out. So it seems like data seems to have plenty of opportunities outside the wire. Space situation awareness with optics and radars, and weather both seem to have plenty of opportunities where there's multiple sensors out there, multiple opportunities to collaborate. And the challenge I have, other than the data analytics and the C2 challenges that we talked about earlier, most of what I've been doing within the Air Force is challenging the Air Force assumption that some of these missions are inherently Air Force missions. So the last barrier, and it didn't come to me until I was on the Hill with then Congressman Bridenstine. Many of the commercial companies out of NewSpace were complaining to the Hill that it's hard to commercialize certain areas if the Air Force is going to continue to give things away for free. So that's, at first I consider that to be complaining, whining, whatever. But the more you think about it, it's a legit argument. So if you really want your industrial base, your global industrial base, to be growing, some of these things, if they're able to be commercialized, why would you not commercialize them? So that is, for the effort I'm working with Bucky with space situation awareness, if we demonstrate a capability to do space situation awareness, and a commercial company is able to have a really good capability to provide routine safety of flight in a catalog, et cetera, not only will the Department of Commerce be interested in that, but frankly, wouldn't I start to acquire that outside of my wire, and why do I have to be doing that within the wire, within the Air Force? I still have to figure out, how do I leverage that? How do I trust it? How do I check on it? But if these commercial capabilities are going to rise, the mission areas I talked about, what I'm finding is as we're doing development and I'm looking to acquire it, those commercial markets can't grow in some cases unless the Air Force pulls out of giving away so much for free. So again, it was required in the 70s when the barriers to entry were really high. The barriers to entry aren't as high anymore. So commercial markets are rising, but they can't rise if we're also struggling with, what's the relationship between U.S. government data and mission provided as a global common, and how does that relate to the commercial markets? So it's SSA, data, and weather, but also downfield block for the commercial companies to show the U.S. government how it can trust those capabilities and let those grow outside the wire.
This next one will be for Bob and for Jim. So with your backgrounds in launch, what excites you about the launch market? It's obviously the biggest bottleneck and both the biggest opportunity in getting things from here to space. So sort of what are your observations and what excites you?
I'll go first this time. So what's interesting is if you look historically, launch has been perceived to be the bottleneck. And it's been a bottleneck not because of capacity, but because of cost. There's always been an excess of launch capacity, at least for the last several decades, as more and more nation states decided for sovereign reasons we need to be able to become a spacefaring nation. And for a long time, it was nation state versus nation state, and some of those nation states were willing to sell at a loss in the commercial market just to get some money in, but to just keep their throughput. What I see now is the commercial sector has significantly disrupted that model, not just in the medium to heavy lift, where Jim and I have quite a bit of experience, but also coming to the marketplace with new and innovative ways to get smaller satellites into orbit. And what I see is a very interesting scenario playing out that in some ways I've seen this story before. For the medium to large market, Uncle Sam has invested and is investing hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to create new launch capability. And there are competitions underway right now to choose winners amongst SpaceX and ULA and Northrop Grumman and potentially others who are building various forms of medium to very heavy rockets. And Uncle Sam is paying a lot of money to create this capability. just like we did in the late 90s with the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle program. And we delivered Atlas V and Delta, and they worked, and there was nothing to launch. Because all the satellites that were being developed were all experiencing developmental delays. And we had a several-year delay for many of those constellations. And it was a very difficult business situation for Lockheed Martin and Boeing, which eventually led to ULA, and that's a whole storyline that can make for an interesting conversation over a beer. But where I see things going now is we're going to pick some winners and losers. There's going to be new proven capability out there. How much of a market is it for the big stuff? Yet to be determined. But the marketplace really seems to be going to smaller. And so the opportunity space, if you're a new space firm, more likely is going to be with a new launch provider with your smaller satellite-based capability. Many satellites can now perform the missions that battle stars have historically done. How do you make that work? And when you begin to show that you can deliver through that new architecture, Uncle Sam is at a point where he will start looking at you because he's running out of money. And he recognizes that the threat is increasing also. And so by you demonstrating your capability, you'll get his attention.
Well, as a chemical person, I was always excited by the loud noises of rocket engines. But aside from that, I'll go in a little different direction. I guess what excites me is that all the technology, whether it's the big vehicles or the impending market coming for the small vehicles, it's all going to enable a new mindset in launch, I think, which is to stop looking at launch as a noisy, exciting ride to space that's the number one threat to killing your satellite, to a logistics model that's all about transportation and networking and nodes and the most efficient way to get things where it needs to go. And that's going to be not just enabled by the fleets of vehicles, but by mobility of upper stages and transport vehicles in orbit that will enable more resilience of our military constellations, as well as probably business models for doing things in space that we have yet to fully imagine, where that's all going to play out. We've always thought that was where we wanted to get, but to have any kind of surplus capacity where you could think about treating logistics in space like you would treat logistics in trucking or shipping, it's been way off in the future. But I think that's coming. I don't know if it's coming in 5 years or 10 years or how long, but I think that's when space transportation and space logistics will start to take on a very exciting dimension.
So there's a great saying that never really made sense to me until a couple years ago. It's you can tell how old you're getting by how young the colonels look. So I think my next question is safe. So Colonel Butow, if you get this right, you get an easy question. If you don't, I'm going to give you a really hard one.
Okay.
What denomination was the bill on the cover of Nevermind that the baby is swimming after?
I'll guess a $20.
It was $1. So now you get this is a all right. Answer this how you want. Is there concern in Silicon Valley over some of the recent, Google deciding they're not going to continue with Project Maven, some of the, smaller groups of people who have decided that defense work is not a good place for the company? Sort of what's been sort of the buzz outside of the media, or what's sort of the reaction, and what do you think about that?
Nope, but let me. I'm going to dodge that question for a sec because I was thinking while they were talking about launch, if Henry Ford was in suspended animation and we woke him up and said, "Hey, come out the parking lot, look at my Tesla," he'd be like, "Hey, that's really cool. I thought about this, but didn't know about this glass thing." And he'd probably give you an A+. If we brought Robert Goddard out of suspended animation, took him out and said, "Hey, take a look at our rockets," he'd be like, "What the hell? Where you guys been at? This is my stuff." So I think one of the things that we have to do is not, we have to kind of slap ourselves in the face, douse some cold water in our face every once in a while, and say, well, are we advancing? Are we pedaling in motion? What are we doing? And so one of the things that I think is going to be really interesting as we go forward launch, and is that we have to keep challenging ourselves to find the safe, dependable, all the things that NASA's brought up are low-cost ways of getting that access to space, because we're not done here. I think we'd probably get like a C on maybe what we're doing with launch, and we have to do better on that. Anyways, getting to your question. No, we're not concerned at all. And in fact, here's the coolest thing. We didn't know when we stood up DIUx at the end of 2015. We had no idea how the commercial sector would receive us. And the good news is that we've never been turned away. We've never had a door shut or closed to us. We've had lots of really interesting discussions with folks. And you have to understand that when we go out looking for commercial technology, a Death Star is not commercial, right? A Death Star is something a villain builds, or we're going to go destroy planets. You build a Death Star. Okay, there's no commercial market for that. The things that we're looking at are all commercial capabilities, and we want to use those commercial capabilities the way they were intended to be used. If I'm going to design and build a weapon system, I'm not going to go to the commercial sector for that. I'm going to go to our defense sector because they know how to do that stuff. And there's all kinds of special requirements. And then we work with a defense industrial base to make sure that we bring in best practices, new and emergent technology from these commercial suppliers so that we can keep ahead of our game. And that's going to be one of the greatest challenges for Russ and others as we go into the future. But I think we're doing the right thing. We're pressing a test. We're building relationships where relationships didn't exist before, and along the way we're going to break some glass, and we're going to have to figure out these things. And I won't talk about specific companies, but maybe note to self, socialize your new relationship with your employees. So as you embark on things working with DoD and others. And that's a temporary setback. That's not a permanent one. So, and Maven is not a DIUx project. So.
All right, excellent work. That was good. We have time for a couple questions from the audience. All right, let's get right here.
Side of the table for quite a while, and now on the commercial side, really there's only one simple thing that's missing to make everybody's job easier, and that's the fact that I believe it's still true. And I'll take synthetic aperture radar as an example. So if you had, let's say, $10 or $20 million, you could do one of two things with that. You could invest, you could award to some commercial companies to try and stimulate the capability, or you could say, the government has this much money, and for the next 10 years, we will spend this much per year buying those services, and let everything else go completely to the commercial side. That same amount of money would stimulate 10 times the VC investment if you were allowed to award those kinds of service contracts going forward. And correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you still do not have the ability to award such a contract. Is that, and your comments on whether or not that's an assessment?
No, that's a great question. You should have asked me the dollar bill question, though, because I was prepared to answer that. Get the easy question. So the interesting thing about synthetic aperture radar, and it just makes sense, right? Why wouldn't we want day night all weather imaging, not just for defense, but there's a whole host of commercial applications for it. But if you go back to like the late 90s, we made, as a government, we made some decisions that brought consequences. We basically, in the late 90s, we made a policy decision that we weren't going to commercialize SAR and capabilities like that. So guess what happened? Italy, Germany, Canada, Japan, the Japanese folks are here today. I saw them earlier. They went and they did it, and they dominate that market. We buy a lot of very beautiful SAR images from commercial companies that are backed by their governments and are doing great work. But the problem is that that business model is not conducive to how we want to do analytics. So we want data, so we just need pixels. We don't necessarily need an image. And you say, well, how many pixels do I need? So I mean, these are the relevant questions that we're going for. So the emerging SAR market is a new market altogether because of the way that's going to be used. In terms of the money is actually is coming. The problem what we're doing is we're treading very carefully because of policy decisions made in the past and sensitivities going into the future. You know, Bob brought up great points about security and everything else, but I tell you what, raise your hand if you're in the room, if you're developing a commercial product for a U.S. market only. Anybody? Nope. Exactly. We have this thing called globalization. If you're a commercial company, you're developing for the global marketplace, not for a small marketplace. And international companies are doing the same thing. So we have to allow our commercial entities to compete globally. If we don't do that, we're going to be really hurting in a few decades. I hope that answered your question.
I would add one other thing on the. So I question the architecture constantly, and I guess I haven't focused as much on ISR. I am doing some things with ISR, but a lot of the stuff I'm doing with space situational awareness would have been equally contentious, and that's the reason we went after it, right? Was to question the assumption that how could you let a commercial company do that? It's easy, one step at a time. We will work that out. But I'll tell you the other thing that I kind of hit on with, and I wanted to focus on what Bob was saying. I think I've got like a $300 million budget that people know about, and then I feel like I'm executing another $300 million of other people's money. And you execute other people's money when you outthink other people. And a lot of the ideas that you all have in this room are really good ideas. And what I've found is I've never worried about finding money for good ideas. Good ideas bring money. But I generated $75 million in congressional ads this last year alone because the senators are really the ones that are interested in growing your market. So I would make sure that you look at, if you generate good ideas and you're having issues with how to move, find the innovators within the government that want to work with you. And a lot of times it's the Hill that I'm finding that's advocating for new ways of doing business. On space situational awareness, Bucky and I got that $20 million from the Hill. I think even your small launch probably came from the Hill. And I think, again, I equate it to the semiconductor industry, right? That New York, California, Texas, we're fighting each other on how to onshore a lot of those semiconductor fabs, how to do that. The senators picked up on, hey, first to market is going to kind of grow a lot of business for that state. As we look to commercialize several of these markets, it's your senators that are probably the ones that are best incentivized to help us demonstrate some of those capabilities. And I feel like I'm practically printing money with the senators right now. But I just wanted to get to that with some of the stuff Bob said. Right? If it's painful to get money from groups that just don't know how to get to the new, go to the folks that want to get to the new. And a lot of those are your congressmen and your senators. And again, international. I'm doing a lot of stuff internationally. Right? Focus on folks who share a vision with you wherever they are.
Time for one more? There's a lot of hesitation, but let's do it.
Hi, so this question comes from a comment made by Colonel Teehan earlier, but is directed to anybody on the panel who wants to answer. So you expressed some concerns that multi-domain operations might slip as a mission for our space services if that were to be separated out from the Air Force. So I'm wondering what you see as the appropriate balance between multi-domain operations and other missions like encouraging and protecting the development of our national economic and commercial interests in space, and if you think that question would be answered differently by the current Air Force structure versus a separate space service. Thank you.
I think I can take a quick shot. So I'm at Air Force Research Lab. I'm in the Space Vehicles Directorate. There's 9 directorates within the lab. When I go to answer that question as one of 9 directorates in an Air Force Research Lab, the other directorates would say, you're nothing but a couple nodes on a networked architecture, and this is how we're creating trust, security, et cetera, within that architecture. We do this all the time with COM, with network nodes, et cetera. When I'm in meetings just with space folks, SMC, Air Force Space Command, and my directorate, I get a totally different answer. No, space is unique. We have to put shields up. We can't talk to anyone. We don't trust anyone. We can't do anything with anyone. And in reality, I think you kind of need a mix of both. And don't get me wrong, I think we'll work the multi-domain aspect. I'm just stating that you have to stay locked on the need for a networked architecture. But I think I do find in the current state of affairs, when you're in a room full of space people, you answer that question totally different than if you're in a room of multi-domain experts that have been working this for years, and they consider you just to be an element of the problem they've been working for years. You don't make the problem special.
Yeah, I'll just add that, for the last several years, the end state that was envisioned of why is space more important than it was a few years ago has really been started with a threat. We're very concerned. We need to be more resilient. And that then leads to the best way to do that is to have everybody working together. So partnerships, enhanced cross-communication and cross-capability between the different sectors was seen as fundamental, probably the strongest, most impactful thing we could do to get to a resilient space architecture that was going to be not just more threat resistant, but also best for the good of everybody. But that proved very difficult to get there, and so that's what we're kind of working through is how do we get there. But I would argue that the folks that are arguing either way on the Space Force really have that end state in mind, and they're really arguing about the best means to get there. Is it with a separate Space Force or not? But I don't think they dispute that the partnerships and the collaboration among the different sectors is really where we want to get for the best end state for all.
All right, for the first annual MilSpace panel, I believe you set an extremely high bar of both innovative thinking and honest answers. So I want to thank the panel for their time and efforts here.